What's up guys, back with another Fallout video, and today I'd like to talk about Fallout 5 and when we might be able to see the next game release. Obviously, before we start, this video will be a speculation-based video, and it's not going to be one of those ridiculous and silly GTA 6 reveal / unboxing / trailer spam videos. And I'm kind of amazed people get away with that. But I digress. Mostly, I'm just going to be talking about when I think Fallout 5 and or whatever the next Fallout game is going to be called may release. So in this video, we'll be talking about Bethesda Game Studios' release history, among many other reasons, as to why we could see a new Fallout game as early as next year. But I guess without further ado, let's talk about Game of the Year editions for the Fallout games. So Fallout 3 originally came out in October of 2008, and after all of the DLC content for that game was released, Bethesda decided to release a Game of the Year edition for Fallout 3 in October of the following year, which would have been 2009. Then there was Fallout New Vegas, which released in October 2010, and after roughly a year in November of 2011, Fallout New Vegas's Ultimate Edition was released, and like the Game of the Year edition for Fallout 3, all of the DLC content was included. Fairly recently, the Game of the Year edition was announced for Fallout 4, and as we all probably know, Fallout 4 released in November 2015, and the Game of the Year edition for Fallout 4 will end up releasing in September 2017 of this year, roughly 2 years after the release of the base game. Now you may be wondering why this information is important. Well, in the past, Bethesda has usually released a Game of the Year or a definitive edition for all of their games about a year after the game is first released. So for example, Fallout 3 had its Game of the Year edition that came out a year afterwards, and Fallout New Vegas had its Ultimate Edition that came out a year after its initial release. What's probably more important is that not much time passed between the release of Fallout 3's Game of the Year edition and the release of Fallout New Vegas. So on some level, it seems like the Game of the Year edition comes out, and then a year after that, we get a brand new Fallout game. And by this logic, it is possible that Fallout 5, or whatever the next game would end up being called, could come out next year in 2018. At the same time, if this trend was consistent, Fallout 4 should have come out in 2012. After all, the Ultimate Edition for Fallout New Vegas released the year before. Instead, Fallout 4 didn't release until 2015. Though I suppose to be fair, the release of Skyrim in 2011 would have put off Fallout 4's release. After all, Bethesda had to get Obsidian to develop New Vegas, while Bethesda could work on Skyrim. It's also worth pointing out that Fallout 4's Game of the Year edition doesn't follow the trend of the other Game of the Year editions for the Fallout games. Fallout 4's released almost 2 years after its initial release. So does that mean Fallout 5 will release 2 years after Fallout 4? Still, I think the release of the Game of the Year edition means that Bethesda is pretty much done with supporting Fallout 4. So while there may be a patch or two after the Game of the Year edition for Fallout 4 releases, Bethesda Game Studios will be focusing on other projects going forward. Speaking of other projects, something that's important to mention is that Fallout New Vegas wasn't developed by Bethesda and was actually made by Obsidian Entertainment. So it might be a good idea to determine Bethesda Game Studios' own release schedule for a lot of their games in making our predictions. Bethesda's first game was 2002's The Elder Scrolls Morrowind, and the final DLC for that game was released in 2003. 3 years later, Oblivion was released, and its final DLC released in 2007, the year before Fallout 3 came out. As mentioned previously, Fallout 3 came out in 2008, and the final DLC released in 2009. And 2 years after that, in 2011, Skyrim releases, and its final piece of content was released in 2012. 3 years after that, Fallout 4 releases, and its final piece of content was completed in 2016. I suppose you could actually argue that Fallout 4 will be entirely done in 2017, with the release of both the Game of the Year edition as well as Fallout 4 VR, but development on Fallout 4 and any DLC content is mostly done with. The trend that you will notice here is that there is a period for when development on a Bethesda Game Studios game ceases and the next Bethesda Game Studios game is released. Typically, this period is 3 years at the longest and about 1 year at the shortest, but more often than not, it's a period of just 2 years. So based on this trend, we could see a new Bethesda Game Studios game come out in 2018 as Fallout 4's final piece of content, Nuka World, released in 2016. Alternatively, it could be 2019 as Fallout 4 VR will release in 2017, and that would be the final piece of Fallout 4 content. I'd say the biggest determining factor between a 2018 or 2019 release would depend on Bethesda Game Studios' level of involvement with Fallout 4 VR. Supposedly, the developers that helped with Fallout Shelter are helping with Fallout 4 VR, and if that's the case, then it's possible we could see a new game as early as 2018. If Bethesda Game Studios is the sole developer behind Fallout 4 VR, then a new Bethesda Game Studios game will most likely be coming out later. I would say another indicator for Fallout 5 or some other Bethesda Game Studios project will be coming out in 2018 would be based on Bethesda's E3 2017 presentation. At E3 this year, Bethesda showed off a number of games. While there were a number of sequels like The Evil Within 2 and Wolfenstein 2, we're mostly getting re-releases of older games like Skyrim on Nintendo Switch, or we're getting a virtual reality version of Fallout 4, Skyrim, and Doom. So for the most part, while there are going to be new releases from other developers that work under Bethesda Softworks, we're mostly getting games from other developers and re-releases of games to play in new ways. When it comes to future E3s, I don't foresee Bethesda showing Skyrim and Fallout 4 again, as they've pretty much exhausted those titles already. As of the release of Skyrim for Nintendo Switch, Skyrim will be available on all of the available platforms, and while I suspect that Fallout 4 VR could come to Xbox One X at some point, and that could possibly be shown at E3 2018, Bethesda isn't going to be able to show Fallout 4 or Skyrim much more than they already have, and they will have to show a new Bethesda-style game sometime soon. If you ask me, 2018 has to be a target release year for some big game that Bethesda is working on. Whether that's Fallout 5 or not is certainly up for debate. However, I don't see Bethesda being able to rely on another Fallout 4 re-release or another Skyrim re-release at next year's E3. Perhaps these titles could be shown again as an announcement for something else, but I think there has to be either a new IP, which many people have been suggesting is Starfield, or it has to be a brand new Fallout or Elder Scrolls game. Another important question to ask is whether the next Fallout game that comes out will in fact be Fallout 5, or whether it will be a spin-off like Fallout New Vegas was. If that's the case, then I can pretty much guarantee that Fallout 5 may not come out for another 3 to 4 years at the very least. As I mentioned previously, Bethesda Game Studios seems to take 2 to 3 years to make a game after the final piece of content is released for their previous game, and it's also worth mentioning that since 2006, Bethesda has been alternating between the Elder Scrolls and Fallout. 2006, of course, saw the release of Oblivion, 2008 saw the release of Fallout 3, 2011 saw the release of Skyrim, and 2015 saw the release of Fallout 4. So it's possible we might not see another Bethesda Game Studios Fallout game for quite some time, as Bethesda would be more likely to focus on either the Elder Scrolls 6, or they may focus on this project Starfield that we've been hearing about. My point is that there's a pretty big gap between Fallout 3 and Fallout 4, and it stands to reason that the official Fallout 5 from Bethesda is still a long ways off. This doesn't mean that we won't see a new Fallout game soon. I think we will, but I do think that it's more likely to be a spin-off game in the veins of Fallout New Vegas, rather than it being a brand new title from Bethesda. The good news is that if the next Fallout game is a spin-off like New Vegas was, I think we are definitely going to be seeing that game very soon. As far as Fallout games in general are concerned, I think we should see something as early as 2018. While I don't think it will be called Fallout 5, it should definitely be some sort of spin-off game like New Vegas was. My main reasoning for this is that Fallout 4 will pretty much be done with the release of both the Game of the Year and virtual reality versions of the game later this year. Not to mention that Bethesda doesn't really have much, if anything, to announce next year at E3, and announcing a new Fallout just seems to make sense. Sure, we could see Starfield or we could see The Elder Scrolls 6, but it seems like both of those games are fairly far off. After all, The Elder Scrolls Online is still getting updates, and Starfield is really just a rumored IP that Bethesda is working on, and I wouldn't expect to see either game until at least 2019. In other words, I think that it simply has to be a new Fallout game or a Fallout spin-off that ends up releasing next year. Otherwise, what else is Bethesda going to release or announce at E3? Doom 2 and The Elder Scrolls 6 seem like their 2019 releases, so my thinking is that it has to be Fallout. But alright guys, I think that's going to wrap up this particular video. If you like this video, feel free to leave a like and let me know when you think Fallout 5 or even the next Fallout game will release. Do you think it's 2018 or do you think it's 2019? Be sure to leave a comment, click the bell to join the notification squad, and as always, take care, and I'll see y'all next time.